This is an armor that used to belong to a warrior of the Mamluk Sultanate. Middle Eastern people were not unarmored, as they are sometimes portrayed in media, and I aim to destroy this stereotype by showing this armor and discussing the armors of the Middle East, and why this stereotype has existed. The earliest armors found in the Middle East go back to the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia from the time of Sumer, where the warriors had heavy bronze armor, and you also see similar types of bronze armor due to a lesser degree in Egypt and remnants of it in southern Arabia as well. Later you also find the earliest evidence for lamellar armor, which comes from sculpted artwork of the Neo-Assyrian Empire's soldiers in the areas of what is modern-day Iraq and Syria. Lamellar armor being small armor plates laced together, and the extremely commonly used armor known as chainmail might have later appeared at first in Middle East, in Mesopotamia, or among the Celts of Europe. Anyway, the Middle East saw the first uses of chainmail on a large scale. Even if peoples in the Middle East might have not been the first to use chainmail, they were the first to implement it on a large scale for large-scale armies. And chainmail armors, they continued to develop from their earliest uses in the early Iron Age to the later ages of antiquity. But it was not just human armor that was used in the Middle East, as you also had, for example, horse armor, used on horses which were ridden by fully armored men. For example, the Persian cataphract that the Persians used to great success against the Romans in the Battle of Pyhrr, where these hyper heavily armored horses and horsemen crushed the Roman legionnaires under the weight of their charges, under the weight of their armors that protected these horsemen when they were doing these heavy charges against the Romans that broke the lines of the Romans and crushed them beneath the hoofs of their horses. The use of heavily armored cavalry such as cataphracts would continue to be used in the Middle East for millennia after this battle. And actually, speaking about what came after this battle by several centuries, after the Arab invasions in the 7th century, Islamic law forbade the forced conscription of free men, which meant that willing soldiers and not levies were the ones doing the fighting, and these would not go to war usually without ensuring the best possible protection for themselves. Hence the best possible armors used to protect them in war. If you are going to go to war by your own volition, you make sure you have the equipment to do so. And free willing soldiers made up a large part of most Islamic armies. Though there were other types of troops as well. For example, slave soldiers that were forced to fight, as they were slaves and could thus be forced to fight, as they were not free men protected by the laws against conscription. But even these slave soldiers tended to be, if anything, better equipped than the more willing troops. If you're going to own a person, feed him and train him all his life to fight for you, which costs a lot of money, then not equipping him with the best in armor, considering all the other costs associated with keeping slave soldiers, slaves only dedicated to fighting, and considering in terms of combat effectiveness, equipping people in armor would be more efficient, and it would be foolhardy to not have them clad in the best of armor, as they are a costly investment and great warriors that can make use of this armor for great benefit on the battlefield. Besides willing troops and slave soldiers, you also had waqf-bound troops that were bound to a waqf or an endowment connected to a mosque congregation. That is to say, soldiers connected to land usage rights, to land owned by a mosque congregation. Land usage rights for which the soldier had agreed to fight for the mosque, for the congregation's sake, in exchange for getting the rights to use the land. Though even in the case of these warriors, they often had stipulations in the contracts that the congregation had to provide them with adequate equipment, so they were often equipped with very heavy armors and good weaponry. Also, as a mosque congregation, you do not want to lose the people actually working the land, as they are bringing in revenue for the mosque by actually working the fields and giving parts of the harvests to the mosque congregation. They are thus incentivized to try to keep these people alive and thus provide them with good armor. And as I've gone through here, it shows that many of the soldiers used in various Islamic armies, all from the earliest times of the Arabic invasions, even to the later parts of Middle Eastern history, were usually heavily armored. And these armors could be everything from gambeson-like armor made from quilted linen, lamellar armors, as I mentioned before, laminar armors, which is pretty much lamellar armor but with larger plates that are interlocking, scale mail, which is armor made of small metal scales that are fastened to each other by various means, either by small metal rings or by interlocking scales or by rope, often made from cutting resistant sinew or leather. After all, you want to keep your armor together in combat. And of course you had chainmail, the armor made of these small rings that are interlocked with each other. Also similar to the Western European world, in the later ages of the Middle East, you did have plate armor too. Though, due to the heat issues associated with plate armor never became as popular in the Middle East as it became in Western Europe. There are actually accounts, even from temperate Europe, of soldiers in full plate armor getting a heat stroke on hot summer days due to the fact that plate armor is one of those types of armor that easily gets overheated. And you can just imagine how bad it would become if you were using this type of armor in the Middle East. But even despite the absence or presence of plate armor in the Middle East versus the presence of plate armor in Western Europe, generally throughout much of history, the Middle East and the soldiers found in the Middle East have been better armored than most European armies, by a fair margin, at least up until the late medieval age, during the height of plate armor use, where you might say that European armies were generally more armored than Middle Eastern armies. But then after that period, you see armor begin to decrease in Europe due to the introduction of gunpowder, making the costs of armor versus its effectiveness less valuable. Though armor was still used in the Middle East, like for example this 16th century Janissary armor. And the Ottomans used troops called Zerli Nefers, which apparently in Turkish means armored soldiers. And that's exactly what they were. They wore armor with this typical disc armor with a turban helmet. Typical of the armies found in the Middle East and in the armies found on the Central Eurasian steppe and in Eastern Europe. So this was quite a widespread style of armor. The widespread use of armor in the Middle East, even before Europeans began to use very heavy armor, and also after the Europeans quit using very heavy armor, has to do with the fact that the Middle East generally has been richer than Europe through most ages, as it has been a center of great civilizations and great commerce, and thus had the money to spend on good armor generally. You can also see that armor was heavily used in Middle Eastern history, in that maces were a popular weapon throughout much of history, and maces are primarily used against armored opponents to break the body beneath the armor. But why, if armor was so common in Middle Eastern history, why do we so often see Middle Eastern pre-modern armies as depicted without armor, or at least clear armor? There are a couple of reasons for this. You have, for example, the fact that it was not uncommon to keep your armor beneath clothing in order to protect yourself from the heat that otherwise would be absorbed by the armor, as metals exposed to sunshine absorb a lot of heat and thus become heat traps that might cause, due to the increased heat heat stroke for you, or at least make it very uncomfortable for you to wear. And this is also one of the reasons as to why plate armor, which is harder to hide behind clothing, was not that much in use in the Middle East, despite having the metallurgical skills to actually make that sort of armor. With this said, certain people did also wear armor outside of their clothing, so this isn't the entire reason as to why Middle Eastern armies are depicted as being without armor. And here I am going to use Edward Said's Orientalist theory, where he describes the tendency of various Western traditions to exotify the Middle East and make them into the strange other. Remember that throughout much of Western history, the Middle East and the various political entities there have been a great enemy for most of Christian European history. Islam and the invasions coming from the Middle East and North Africa were perceived as the great threat to fight against. It is actually pretty late in European history, in the 18th century and onwards, where this view of the Middle East and Islam being a great threat against Christian Europe was no longer as much the case. But it did leave its legacy in art depictions, especially during the Middle Ages. And thus depicting Middle Eastern soldiers as being without armor is a type of propaganda of Middle Easterners not being professional soldiers or warriors that are armored, but rather as invading hordes that can be defeated, that can be easily defeated, despite the truth often being the contrary. The depiction of unarmored Middle Eastern soldiers gives a sense of superiority and a sense of hope in this propaganda against these Middle Eastern hordes that are depicted in this propaganda against the Middle East, made by various European artists that wanted to depict the righteousness of the Christian cause against Islam. In addition, you also have stylistic considerations of wanting the enemy to stand out from your own side, from wanting the other side to be distinct from your own, to show them as being different, both due to the aforementioned sense of superiority, but also due to practical considerations of just showing clear sides in depictions where they are fighting each other. Also, armor is complex to paint, and it's not like European paintings, especially medieval European paintings and art, have not ignored the armor of European soldiers and warriors too, historically. And this legacy of depicting Middle Eastern soldiers as being unarmored has affected later depictions of them in Western traditions. Though matters of practicality are also present here as well. For example, in modern times, in movies, it is easier to not have armor on actors or animating armor on actors when you use computer technologies to animate it in, as that requires additional work and additional props to use for a movie, for example. And this is probably also the case when video games and computer games have reproduced this stereotype with badly equipped troops, as it is probably also due to animation issues and the costs of animating armor and smaller details on troops. So there is a combination here of previous Orientalist depictions of Middle Eastern soldiers and their armors being absent, and matters of practicality that have enforced or strengthened these depictions as well. And thus this stereotype has survived into our days, and also been somewhat reinforced and strengthened, even to ages before the advent of Islam, where you see Middle Eastern soldiers that either only wear the most basic of clothing or are nearly naked. Yet it should be said, with cheaper animation methods and much more knowledge of history, I am seeing more depictions of well-armored Middle Eastern soldiers in more recent times. Much more similarly to how Christian knights and European armies have been depicted as being armored. And I hope you, my viewers, liked this video where I discussed Middle Eastern armors in their context and the stereotype about Middle Eastern warriors being unarmored. Please post comments and questions, I appreciate them.
Please do subscribe as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.